Hello, and welcome to another episode of Secretary of Alchemy. Today is the 5th of May, 2025. I'm recording this outside. I'm probably going to have to do this from now on. Things seem to be coming to a head in regards the astrological sign of Cancer, okay? So I'm trying to get all that down. And out of the way is kind of a baseline understanding that facilitates further studies into the secretary of alchemy. Important consideration here. Earth element is precipitate. Fire element is precipitant. Air element is catalytic. Water element is solvent. And then there's the whole issue of the fifth element that you could call spirit, which would be assigned to the aeon up the top of the tree, the secret tree of alchemy. Kind of an other dimensional consideration much of the time, outside the context of energetic responses to such presence that you would call spiraling expressions of libido, emotion, quantum physical phenomena, whatever. I recorded some other material that I was hoping would be Capricorn related as much as possible, but a lot of it is still Cancer related, but I got sidetracked. And since the early 20s of April, which was the last time I recorded anything, I got harangued up with issues associated creatively with having to edit. So I'm kind of knee-deep in editing previous videos. I've got I think 2 or 3 videos in the pipeline for that, and this one's kind of having to supersede one of those videos because it's more important. The other videos kind of a lot of ideation leading up to these conclusions that I've been drawing of late. So to start off with, Taurus and Gemini considerations are important here to start off with. Zero, the concept is zero. Con meaning together, meaning together. Sept meaning essentially take, right? It's a specific take. The concept of zero. Okay, zero is something arrived at conceptually, systematically, extrapolatively, through a number of different kinds of considerations, some of them geometric, some of them out of observations into nature. So zero is kind of considered to be comparatively divine as far as the digits are concerned, right? It's considered to be origin, not only mathematically when discussing continuous number lines and Cartesian coordinate considerations, right? But also it's kind of considered to be origin as far as metaphysics and nature are concerned. Metaphysics being something, shall we say, ascendant or higher than physics, right? Something above, so to speak, which somehow establishes a mirror image of itself below, so to speak, in nature, right? So, yeah, the Fool trump card in Tarot symbolizes zero, the concept of zero. Something that is so green and full of hope and vitality that it's associated with relative infancy. The whole idea of being kind of foolish in your innocence, your pure innocence, and lack of acquired knowledge, right? It's something that appears seemingly out of nowhere, completely innocent and full of hope to the degree that it's possible for anything specific at all to be full of hope, right? Hope is a concept assigned to, or categorized under Taurus, the archetype. The bull that establishes relations, right? So, this establishing relations is important here. The divine spark that comes into existence seemingly from nowhere. The ram's heads butting together at a singular, infinite distant point, so to speak. That's an important consideration here. Because we're talking about getting into or initiating a process in Gemini that establishes the whole concept of a set. In mathematical terms, you're talking about a collectivity with finite properties enough such that these properties can be defined as a specific constituency or collectivity, a membership or a collection, if you will, properties associated with or parameters functionally initially established seemingly out of nowhere, out of Gemini really, but Gemini is really everywhere. Every possible where, right? Whereas Aries is nowhere, right? No specificity, no location. Taurus kind of is in between in initiating this metaphysics function of Gemini. It's a metaphysical function. It's beyond physics in the sense of being ascendantly higher, yet also that which establishes the properties of nature that can be observed and quite often measured. Okay? What can be observed can be measured in some fashion, even if only a relative fashion, right? So, in between 0 as origin and the first mundane expression of digit in the number system, the Arabic numerals that we've adopted as a number system, the counting numbers for digits going from 1 to 9, right? With 0 initiating the whole thing and establishing the concept of whole numbers. Yeah, it's a crowded and loud day today. Just had to jump out of the way of somebody. Okay. So 0 is always considered to be comparatively divine in the secret tree of alchemy and effectively in mathematics too, as being central in the sense of being considered as origin, right? In the Cartesian coordinate system, for example, made up of continuous number lines, expressive in both directions, positive and negative, from 0 in dimensions, either 1 dimension, 2 dimension, or 3 dimensions. out of which we formulate relationships between objects and 1, 2, or 3-dimensional space, right? But right in the center of all that is 0, origin. So between 0 and the first mundane expression of numeric value that we've labeled the number 1, the secret tree of alchemy there is placed in Gemini number 10, between 0 and 1 for some reason, having to do with expressing, some manner of either nature or supernature. Super meaning basically above nature, in the same sense that meta means above, same general sense. So somehow the symbolism of the number 10 is important here in Gemini. And these symbols didn't just fall out of the sky, arguably, ever arguably, simply because certain things can't be proven except, through practical application of one kind or another, even if just logic workings, right? As a means of establishing very strong likelihood that there is such a thing as metaphysics, okay? And related abstract considerations, right? So the number 10 is Gemini. That's the mundane numeric value expression assigned specifically to Gemini. Symbolizes a process of some kind that is arrived at conceptually and extrapolatively, systematically. Okay? And then, of course, in Cancer, you've got the number 1, or ace. The aces are assigned there. Okay? Taurus traditionally is earth elemental. The situation orientation established, geometrically speaking, in the form of what is conceptualized in association with considerations of infinite distant point, okay, on a geometric level. Okay? That's a situation of Taurus. It's basically an expression or an approach to the concept of nothing or no thing, right? It's one of two major approaches, the other one being Aries, which is the singularity as conceptions are concerned. Again, it's a conception, a take, an approach to a consideration arrived at, okay? Extrapolatively. You get into Gemini, Taurus, Aries. All these things are conceptions arrived at, takes arrived at. A take is basically an approach. So we get out of the singularity in Aries into the concept of a singularity in Taurus, of which there is always an infinite multitude, okay, of singularities, each one of which is symbolized by Taurus the bull, okay? The bull that establishes relations, we'll say, humorously speaking. And just like I've explained before, the defined spark in the same instant that it comes into existence specifies via the initiation of relations between itself and that which is like enough to itself to form a relationship between two different metaphysical perspectives, metaphysically maintained perspectives, right? These things cannot be observed in nature. They cannot be measured. They will never be sensed by any instrument of human design, okay? Or build. So this relationship established out of Taurus into Gemini, symbolized now geometrically speaking by the line that deviates from perfectly straight, because a perfectly straight line symbolizes Aries in this system of consideration here. Okay, no line in nature is perfectly straight. Gemini establishes that basic baseline reality, right? But not until Cancer and later basically explicate out of the implication that constitutes Gemini, okay? So, yeah, with Cancer you get a complete circle as the most basic geometric consideration that Cancer categorized, okay, astrologically speaking. But Gemini is simply lines, even just a line of consideration that symbolizes relationship established between 2 points of consideration of metaphysical scope, which means non-physical, beyond nature, okay, metaphysical, supernatural, okay, that's what supernatural really means. There's a lot of hokum surrounding that word in modern culture and past culture, which is mostly just a blind that keeps people from seeing what original meanings are associated with some of these words, right? So the number 10 symbolizes this somehow, but we have to bring Aries to bear on this consideration, right? Because the 1 is placed next to the 0 in the number 10, right? So they are peers, and since 0 is divine, so then is this expression of the number 1. It's not merely a mundane expression of 1. Okay, that takes place in Cancer. But the divine consideration of the number takes place in Aries, which is peer with Taurus. Okay? Effectively, relative to our perspective of consideration taking place all the way down at Pisces low and at Sagittarius level of, perceptual workings, right, in the mind. So, this number 1 that you see next to the 0 in the number 10 is Aries. Okay? That's why the number 10 is placed there in Gemini. Because it's before the establishment of the mundane digits in Cancer with the ace or the number 1, right? So you got 1 and 0. Now 0 as a symbol implies at its center of the oval shape or the round shape an infinite distant point, a point that is not perceived or measured itself. It is not specifically located by any natural means of observation, perception, beyond conceptual perception, and only generally, right? So, yeah, nothing locates it specifically from out of nature's perspectives, okay? It's infinite distance, so we symbolize it. At first, the concept of 0 was symbolized using a written point, but this turned out to be a practical problem due to errors introduced in mathematics whenever a point was never successfully written down, right? You develop errors in your mathematics. So even on a practical level, the oval became a necessity, or else the other symbol for multiplication, other than the point, the X became a necessity, right? But the oval is useful here in its symbolism as a Gemini consideration. If you want to get into the understanding of how a universe or a set is, shall we say, explicated from out of metaphysics, okay? X doesn't quite serve the purpose, symbolically speaking. Unless, of course, you use that symbol, but the X doesn't symbolize a whole universe. It symbolizes Taurus. The multiplying initiation, the fixed sign Taurus, has water elemental properties on a self-orientation level and earth elemental properties on a situation level, okay? And this is important because I just described the earth elemental situation in infinite distant point terms. This is how strange thinking gets up at this part of the tree, right? But on a self level, you're initiating the water element or relations, okay? Gemini is also water elemental on a self orientation level, but air elemental or catalytic on a situational level. Okay, Gemini amplifies, things that already exist, I guess you could say, or as soon as Cancer comes into existence anyway, right? So on the self level, you don't really have a self until Cancer is established, or a set, constituency, a collectivity that you would call soul, right? There are elements that combine together to constitute, I should say, soul, all right? As a collectivity, as a set that has individual properties that are fast becoming natural properties, okay? Characteristics of ultimately personality and other such things, physical characteristics even, that tend to maintain a consistency from lifetime to lifetime. Same as personality across situations. So you got 1 and 0 side by side, number 10. Now, just as soon as 1 becomes associated with anything, even metaphysical, on a specified level or a specifying level, which is what Taurus initiates, specificity, the baseline establishment of specificity, right? It's no longer Aries, but more likely something like Capricorn. Thus, fence, the concept of fence. Remember when I talked about field and fence associated with the Hebrew lettering, associated with the astrological sign of Cancer, or the Chariot trump card in the frame up of the card? Okay. It becomes kind of a Capricorn thing. So you associate things like confusion and conflict with this establishment that you would call the seed of corruption that exists just as soon as anything metaphysical or natural comes into existence, right? You call it original sin or initial dissonance, okay? Somehow that which is untrue is dissonant. It is not completely harmoniously sound, okay? Therefore, there's a deviation from what we would call truth. So this place is loud today. I'm out walking around. It's louder than on parade day the last time I did this. So, yeah, and then they stopped doing that just as soon as I walked by. So, yeah, so Gemini, functionally speaking, because it's a mutable sign, right? Formulates, metaphysically speaking, the fence aspect associated with set development. You know, there's a set notation associated with set development in mathematics as one example. It's a good idea to learn that set notation and all the meanings associated with it so that you can understand the parameters initially established through sets that are used for, you know, designing mathematical functions. If you think of a mathematical function as Gemini, or not Gemini, but Sagittarius, okay, as an analogy, you think of set notation and related definition as associated with Cancer. You know, the whole concept of a mathematical equation, though, is Sagittarius. Equality, of course, is Virgo, as above, so below. Mathematics, you know, extrapolates conceptually right up into metaphysics through its relationships expressed in relatively abstract terms, right? You can study mathematics as an isolated subject because of this, right? And the system of it works when it, you know, if we're capable of making it truthfully work, you know, and draw, you know, solutions to mathematical, or arrive at solutions to mathematical problems, right? There is the concept of no solution, though. That's assigned to Aries. There is no solution for this mathematical equation or functional expression, right? Or you can run into the concept of all solution, which is Gemini, symbolized by the infinity sign, I'm pretty sure. I'm not an expert mathematician, by the way, but I'm learning some very basic things about math of late, very slowly, calculatedly, in association with alchemy and psychology and things from, you know, perspectives that I maintain on a little bit more of an expert footing because of my years of experience compared with, you know, my mathematical footing, which is still limited, but I'm gaining some very, very fundamental understandings here just from the Secret Tree of Alchemy and just, you know, paging through introductory algebra textbooks and other sources, even YouTube. So anyway, when you tend something, right, that symbolizes a multiplication taking place, because Gemini is aware multiplication on a certain level takes place. It's a comparatively mysterious process, right? Where things seem to multiply, you know, from out of nowhere, so to speak. Taurus and Aries constituting together in pure relationship, you might say, the concept of nowhere or no thing, right? Approached from two different perspectives, each their own and also metaphysical in nature. But the concepts are concepts routinely enough arrived at throughout human history, systematically, from out of naturally maintained perspectives, right? Eventually, they'll be able to figure out how to satisfy the scientific community that such a thing is possible, but I don't know, I think people will have to relax a little bit politically before that can take place. So, yeah, philosophy's always contended throughout history. Philosophers are sometimes executed in mass when political activities are taking place, especially when those political activities are covert of nature and basically tricks played upon the populations in a city-state, for example. They might decide to just exile the philosophers, some of them kill the other philosophers. So Because, it can be very inconvenient to politics, philosophy. This love of wisdom and systematic thinking that boils down to logic, sometimes for its own sake. Systematically speaking, in a manner that works, all right? Proves its worth over time. So, that's basically what mathematics is all about. So you got one. It's basically like somebody put up some fencing, functionally speaking, metaphysical fencing being put into place that'll eventually become, symbolically speaking, the outer limits fencing of a universe or a universal consideration. Okay, something so baseline, basic, fundamental to our orientation in regards to the nature of reality, right? Something that establishes finite properties. Okay, so that which is called original sin, nature makes practical value of in establishing that which is at least partially, initially finite, and eventually a lot more finite. But what we consider to be finite has a lot to do with limitations placed upon us by nature rather than supernature. Okay? The universe still seems to us to be infinitely huge. And on a certain level, you could argue that case convincingly, probably forever. But others will always be able to argue there has to be finite qualities associated with our universe. What is at the outer edge of the universe that makes me so confused on the subject? Well, eventually you can arrive at concepts associated with that systematically, right? That's what we're doing here. We're taking an approach to it from out of Taurus through Gemini into Cancer, okay? So you got 0 on one side of the fence established, or establishing, I should say, in Gemini as a function. Ever is it establishing, okay? It is constituting or becoming constituent in an ever-changing manner that maintains effective linkages with the concept of the infinite. Gemini is ever doing that for every universe, you could argue, all right? On some level. It is the intelligence aspect that is always in the background of the mind that can find ultimate expression through the quiet voice of intuition, right? Which tends to express itself through the emotions or through synchronicities, right? The Jungian term, synchronicities, I guess, if I remember correctly. So, and these things are sometimes clued into or perceived, but not really proven in a scientific sense. You can prove the idea of knowledge without logical considerations taking place, probably to a degree of precision useful enough to scientists, right? Usually self-report measures used to arrive at such conclusions, which are always questionable to at least some degree, and you have to take very many of those measurements to arrive at increasingly valid terminology relating to the whole issue, right? So 0 is on one side of this fence. It's expressed there, symbolically speaking, for some reason, but nothing is expressed on the other side of the fence. But in mathematical terminology, you could always argue that there's the implication of zeros being on the other side of that fence, but it's not expressed here. And of course, on a practical level, such expressions in mathematics would be confusing, unnecessary. It's best to keep things simple, straightforward, right? 10 can be expressed as 10 or 10.0 0 in the real number system, right? Where you have intervals of consideration on either side of the scores that you're collecting in scientific measurements, right? Upper limits and lower limits, or real limits, considered, right? If you get into statistics and science at all. But, where you deliberately focus is where you're collecting data, right? That's the data you want to collect, but there are scales of measurement to consider, right? Continuous, like with a continuous number line, made practical use of in formulating a measurement scale, or discrete variables where you can't divide the whole number expressions up into smaller fractionals, right? Smaller fractions on the number line. But you can place these considerations on a number line just the same. So number 10 is a metaphysical expression pretty strongly, okay? As well as an in-nature expression associated with, measurements of variability and what have you. So it's kind of in between the mundane number 1 consideration down in Cancer, the counting number consideration, or the digit number consideration, where you start counting with the forefinger of your right hand 1, right? That's Cancer perspective. Divine consideration of number 1 is Aries. That's just its categorization and the sequence of events or metaphysical procedure associated with reality explication. All right, or precipitation ultimately. Sagittarius being practical, on practical level, functional level. Precipitation taking place for a finite period of time, typically, often periodically or cyclically, but comes and goes, right? Just like the rain. There are strengths and weaknesses associated with the fire element. Just like the other elements, one of these considerations is the idea that which is mortal. It's here, then it's gone at some point. But at Sagittarius level consideration, we're talking about a finite period of time. Something exists, something specific, something natural. But up in Gemini, there's a process up where I work up here that we can arrive at conceptually that denotes the idea that certain things have to be established just for reality to be able to, within our view, establish itself, right, and maintain itself. That's what metaphysics is. Functionally speaking, a Gemini consideration. Now, you could conceptualize, using tarot symbolism, the idea that the 0 in the number 10 symbolizes the Fool, the tarot card, the trump card, the Fool, where the concept of 0 is assigned in the tarot deck and in the secret tree of alchemy. It is, in its own way, meta or contextual for priestly existence, right? The Hierophant trump card, a face card in the stacks that I've talked about before. So, it's historically contextual, dating back through into human prehistory, right? And of course, the whole Hierophant concept or priestly concept is more recent in relative human history, right? Thus, it's a face value kind of consideration of earlier considerations of things that are more likely to take place spontaneously, right? And 0 is all about spontaneity, of the utmost initial value, I guess you could say. But it only becomes value when it is in a relationship with others of like enough nature, or shall we say supernature to itself. So we got the fool pictured on one side of the fence, okay, but not pictured on the other side of the fence. But it's implied, of course, if you've got a fool on one side of the fence, or fools, you've also got a fool or fools on the other side of the fence. But we don't have to express that other consideration, the other side of the fence, here. This is expressive of just a process of metaphysics, okay? Consideration-wise, conceptually considered, philosophically, right? In abstract terms that touch base with mathematics, okay? So what could be going on the other side of that fence could be anything. Same as, the 0 potentials at work, all full of hope on the expressed side of the fence. So what could be going on that other side of the fence could be anything from the production of bagels to Jack the Ripper business going on over there. Of course, when you have that fence there, it's not a complete barrier by a long shot. It's just kind of an obstacle. You kind of lean on it even. But what's leaning on one side of the fence might be coming alive. At the same time, what's leaning on the other side of the fence is disappearing from existence. So all of these possibilities exist, so to speak, in heaven and on earth. They could be, for the most part, mundane, sometimes very positive, and sometimes very negative, right? If you're, considering Jack the Ripper as kind of an archetype for what might be going on the other side of that fence you're leaning up against. You just heard sounds of something going on over there and felt a thump on the fence from the other side. That constitutes communication. That constitutes a relationship, okay, between these two infinite distant points of consideration. So this might be a base archetype for something like reincarnation too, how it actually takes place. Your soul instantaneously reconstituting itself in an appropriate dimension, just as it kind of disappears out of another whole dimension, right? So, but we don't have to picture what's going on the other side of the fence for our purposes, which is what the number 10 symbolizes. We're establishing both field and fence of universal scope of consideration here, ultimately of perception, okay, on some level. What can we perceive of the universe within which we live? Well, some of it's quite obvious, some of it is downright confusing, and some of it is simply not known, or even maybe not knowable as far as actual experience is concerned of any particular kind. Even conceptual, you could argue, because our considerations become particularly abstract and geometrically symbolic when we get up into this part of the tree, right? The number system that we like to use, born of these considerations over a long period of time. That number system can be operated in accordance with laws established through consistency of use in what are considered to be valid terms, right? Mathematical terms. You got accuracy and consistency to take into consideration here when evaluating the number system and mathematics. Same as with scientific considerations and statistical considerations, right? what constitutes accuracy. Okay, when you get into statistics, this becomes a lot more relative. It has to do with correlations taking place to a degree, maybe in a causal manner that we can isolate condition-wise to study, right, in scientific terms. If we can't, then we're stuck with correlations, right? Strong likelihoods taken into consideration, what data patterning becoming evident through our application of descriptive statistics actually means, right? And then we infer using inferential statistical means or procedures. Okay, that's a series of operations collected together as a set. Okay? There are standardized methods that are made use of. They've proven their practical value to the point where people value statistics, right? Even just, getting an average score, for something as mundane as a football season, right? Or an individual associated with a team, functioning as a functionary on a team within the context of a sports season, right? The fools on that side of the fence, valuing spectator sports where some other fools are out at Comic-Con or something, valuing comic books. They're kind of two different sets, but the fence that divides them isn't so clearly evident all the time, right? It can be a rather confusing consideration, right? Just like with what lies beyond the edge of the universe, exactly. So, fence and field are established here. I'm pretty sure I discussed that comprehensively enough. Take a short break here, put some things in the freezer, maybe start up in a quieter environment again here. So then we have a process of multiplication considered at a particularly primordial level of consideration, right? And it's grounded in numbers, the numbers of mathematics, numeric value, okay? Value being established through relationships, okay? Gemini establishes value in the process of creating, or shall we say, generating or constituting, anything that you would call an entity. Now, an entity can be symbolized by something like a circle that completely closes itself, which also symbolizes Cancer. I like to think of it as an entirety of consideration, okay? Entirety or finite dimension has been established on some level. Still, at Cancer level of consideration, it is definitely touching base very directly with what one might call infinite function, where literally anything can happen. But there's a relationship here that is maintained. Therefore, there will be constants associated with it, right? Consistencies, which ground into the finite. So when something has constitution, there are consistencies associated with that. You have a tangible concept in mind when you consider at this level. For example, considering our entire universe, we can consider it to be an entity of some kind that has finite properties. But we have difficulty defining the outer limits of that consideration, that particular consideration. Things aren't that much different in face-to-face encounters. There's that which you can immediately consider as an entity that you're interacting with, what we would call an individual. there are boundaries evident of some scope and scale, right? Associated with this entirety of being that we're encountering, right? But we can't perceive everything associated with that entity or that being, right? There are things we just don't know, where at a certain level of consideration, anything could be taking place within the entirety of mental scope or psyche associated with that individual, right? This is symbolized pretty heavily in the trump card called the Devil, which symbolizes Capricorn. Initial encounter, okay? There's always a certain amount of suspense associated with initial encounter. One is careful during initial encounters, and it pays to be appropriately polite, I guess you could say. And there's certain behaviors associated with initial encounter that are designed to not only facilitate a relationship of more sophisticated scope developing between two individuals encountering each other for the first time, but also protecting the self that is encountering this other self within the context of a situation, okay? A larger situation. Again, you could think of a situation as an entity of a sort, much more difficult to accomplish. You could think of it as an entirety, but you don't perceive that the entire scope or dimension of that entirety, now do you? There is so much context associated with situation that reaches up into infinite levels of consideration that get lost to perception in the metaphysical considerations. You can arrive there systematically, toying around with concepts that imply certain contexts, right? That we would deem to be metaphysical to the degree there's no way to perceive directly what's going on, or empirically, I should say. Direct observation. Where there's direct observation, there's always some degree of measure being taken. It's part of nature. Any conscious entity is, measuring a situation continually, even if on a preconscious level, or sometimes at what Freud would call on an unconscious level, where neurosis could be afoot, bringing about what Wilhelm Reich would call, possibility-wise at least, emotional plague reaction, at least potentially, right? Depending on how tempered you are in your conduct in life, right? Either naturally tempered or as an acquired skill, becoming a stronger talent as it becomes more automatic, right? Over time, the dendrites of the brain even developing along those lines. Dendritic development is particularly important as a consideration, even when thinking in terms of inherent talent, right? Versus acquired talent. In acquired talent, dendritic development is an even larger consideration compared with axonal development, right? Which is quite a large consideration when discussing inherent talent. Very many of these inherent talents we all share together as a species that evolved into what it is as an entity all its own within, a context situationally shared with other species that also evolved through the same geological time scale of Earth history, right, that we did. Different locations, though, situations differing, but, nature and nurture all working together, right? And then, of course, death. having its say in the process, and also reproduction having a say that results in evolutionary or natural selective breeding, if you will. So, what exactly is creator associated with creation anyway? Well, that's a really complex subject, not something to impose upon people as though you know everything because you've got a handbook that tells you what to think, right? So then, fence, field, you're establishing through Gemini in relatively serene and tranquil terms, fence and field, we call universe. Also, the possibility of universal thinking establishes itself. Baseline parameters are laid down in set fashion, as though something initially defined the set that constitutes our universe from out of metaphysics, a process of some kind we can't directly observe or experience. So then this entity exists. We perceive it to be an entity, our universe. We don't seem to be able to see much beyond that except maybe dreams, Pisces high, or abstract considerations getting lost into nothing, whereas Gemini, Taurus, Aries, right? But with Cancer, things are more real. Things are also more finite in relative scope, but not completely finite. Is anything ever really completely finite that you encounter? The quantum physicists would say no, in my opinion. Even a rock they pick up off the ground, it's finite in certain respects, but also the quantum physicists would tell you, well, there are contexts at work here that reach into seemingly nothing, right? That, this nothingness that is somehow infinite in scope, but there's also a somethingness there. Somethingness you could call Gemini that is also infinite in scope, that is active, processing, on a certain level, that produces what we experience as the baseline of our existence, our universe, right? So the number one is, of course, a phallic entity, or in this case, we're talking about a digit as an entity, right? Its own universe. It's got certain properties associated with it. Because it's real to us, it has certain phallic properties, especially, the number one, right? Every other number is more complex somehow than the number one. It's just a line drawn, as though drawn in the sand, right? Symbolizes fence, but the number 1 and 0 combined together symbolizes the process of constituting on a field level, bounded somehow by fence concept, right? Because there's only one fence there in the number 10. We're making this thing happen here. We call it number 10. It combines divine considerations with mundane considerations of finite scope. That which is divine is somehow metaphysical. So the number 1 and the number 0. The number 0 is particularly divine, but the number 1, as kind of a dividing line, you might say, symbolizes a junction between that which is finite in scope and that which is infinite in scope. That which is infinite in scope can be expressed as, well, nothing particularly expressed, right? So one side of that fence line established there doesn't express anything as far as we can perceive, but some fool is leaning up against the other side of the fence there. Some 0 character. It's got characteristics maybe in the form of a tarot card, right? It symbolizes a process that we associate with multiplication and the number system, right? Also, it's a metaphysical process of some kind, described and explained by the symbolism of the number 10. Description, explanation, right there, in abstract form, relatively speaking, and grounded within the context of a number system and how that number system functions mathematically. But what is established initially out of this is something you would call a mathematical set. There's a specific notation associated with that. And sets very often, you might say, formulate or constitute parameters that ultimately define everything taking place with the constituency of that set, or the members of that set, the elements of that set, right? As they are fed into functions that we deem to be appropriately associated with a given set, a set with defined properties that effectively are parameters, right? We might even emulate the Gemini factor using a supercomputer that just substitutes numbers in and out of that set or something like that. AI has to get involved, right? I guess. But, yeah, and then those numbers might be fed through a function. Okay, we're talking about something that it's not just an act, but a function. It repeats itself cyclically, you might say. And different numbers meaning different things at different times as it functions, right? And there's the automatic element associated with that we call Leo. And then there's the deliberate element associated with that we call Aquarius. Fixed signs, initiations. In between is another initiation called Scorpio that is initiating a function again and again and again and again and again. It gets fed a different number for some reason. The function changes. It transforms, right? Transformation is an important consideration in statistics. Transforming a specific expression, mathematics or whatever, or numbers or proportions. An example would be transforming proportions 0.02 into a percentage, which is basically 2%, right? Things like that. Transformations take place. Alchemy becomes a conceptual, intellectual consideration in life, experienced. I think that definitely covers it for now. I kind of lost track with what else I wanted to discuss. So I'll leave you there. Thank you for listening. Just realized what it was that I wanted to discuss. Okay. The universe itself. Now we're getting into Cancer considerations here again, but on a more practical level. Think of a universe as the initiation of a development that you would call a circuitry development of some kind, right? Because you think in terms of there being a circuitry associated with our universe, as one example. You know, the operational parameters are kind of outer limits defined by the nature of the universe itself as a set, right? Thinking mathematically again, right? A constituency, a constitution, a collectivity, okay? So you could think of this as baseline, like, you know, a circuit board exists of a kind, right? And this universe has what you might call interests functioning in association with it, okay, from metaphysical perspective and also natural perspective, right? Valuation is constantly taking place, for example, in nature. You know, what's in it for me kind of a deal associated with survival and related thriving, right? So, why is this important? Because certain things are taking place within the universe that are mirrored in, for example, the way the body manages things, the human body as a universe, and also the way the planet as a quote-unquote universe manages itself, energetically speaking, circulating etheric flow or what Wilhelm Reich would call organotic flow and pulsation, right? Barely perceivable, okay, and even arguably, some people insisting, that the blue glow in a vacuum tube with a filament in it is expressive of static electricity and not orgone energy concentration, right? I haven't seen these experiments up close and personal. I've just kind of read about them. So I can't comment too usefully on that subject, but I know of the considerations going back and forth on the subject of orgone biophysics. But orgone biophysics are important here because you can observe organotics taking place within the context of the Earth as a quote-unquote universe, where induction of a sort seems to be taking place in association with transformations that are implied, at the very least, associated with what Wilhelm Reich called deadly orgone. There's orgone energy, and then there's deadly orgone energy. Deadly orgone energy is the expressed energy state in nature that expresses stasis, relatively speaking, to the point where it's associated with such things as depression, okay? And the energy tends even to collect in geographical depressions or low elevation areas like Death Valley and what have you, arguably. But if you've ever seen what results from the use of orgone accumulation and cloud busting, you would know the truth of what I'm talking about. And I see the signs of these things taking place pretty regularly since about 2016 in the United States and around the United States. Even as far away as Germany, okay, I suspect certain flooding of an extreme nature in Germany was the result of it, but it's hard to say because I haven't been watching the weather in a detailed manner much further into this century than the year 2000. So back in 2000, I was paying close attention. That's when certain activities of this nature came to a head. Also resulted in a deadly orgone wall coming down all along the California coast, all the way up the coast of the United States, releasing weather energy into the United States, which resulted in storm activity, right? Literally, the wall was taken and thrown into the Great Lakes region and the Gulf of Mexico region, right? Where things became a bit static for a time, prior to, I guess, the middle of the decade to follow. Stasis, okay, staticky, sticky energy state, okay, state of living energy that's in the process of what you might call transforming itself into an oblivion that doesn't exist in our dimension if it exists anywhere at all, okay? Oblivion, pure oblivion, of course, is an Aries consideration, but relative oblivion or stasis in a real sense is a Capricorn analogy. The phallic nature of the number one that I was discussing is Capricorn nature. It's all designed to express certain relationships that imply at the very least certain kinds of functions taking place, even up into the metaphysics. Divine consideration of the number one is metaphysical. Realistic or mundane consideration of it is universal but realistic or real. We can tangibly work with the number one and then follow that with number two and then three and then four all the way through the digits to 9 and then beyond the single digits, right? Where 10 factor becomes a practical consideration. In fact, it does in Gemini. Multiplication symbolized there. Kind of, it's got 1 foot in the divine and 1 foot in the practical, the number 10. It's 0 brings the divine into a number, I guess you could say. even though it represents as a placeholder 0 numeric value, right, in a number. So getting back into the circuit board here, transformers, a process known as induction is associated with these things. You're like, typically either you're, electrically speaking, you're increasing voltage with the use of a transformer and the related circuitry, or current. I believe most often it's current. Current amplification in an amplifier is the final stage. Voltage amplification or gain, increasing the voltage, relatively speaking, is an earlier stage or a amplifier stage. Generally speaking, right? But something similar to this goes on with the universe on an organotic level. Okay, so you have a relatively toxic situation at some point within the universe, right? So what does nature do on a universal scale to help preserve the universe? Well, an inductive process takes that relative toxicity and marginalizes it to the outer bounds of the universe to be a part of that function out there that we call fence, that we just established as fence relative to field establishment, right? In the establishment and maintenance of our universe, right? So nature just puts it where nature feels it belongs, out there on the periphery. But what's going on out there on the periphery? Some kind of transformation very likely is taking place. It has to do with the interaction between dimensions, right? It's a form of contactfulness expressed in what we would think of as intimate terms, okay? Dimensions are close to other dimensions that are like enough to themselves, right? You could think of Gemini as an infinitely huge cluster of dimensions all together, forever and ever and ever, producing pure movement together, pure light. Even all the big bangs and divine sparks together are Gemini, right? In movement, pure movement, whereas Aries is pure stasis. There is no movement in Aries. We can place concepts there, symbolically speaking, impossible concepts like pure sense, okay, taking place, pure sensory action of some kind, or which isn't really an action, but something intangible to us. So we place it there, right? Gemini is a different variation on that thing. Pure movement, pure illumination, pure light. Can't be experienced, though. Too intense for any entity, individual entity to experience, right? Gemini is all entities, all entireties of consideration all at once, right? And illumination, we would call it form, I guess. But since it's beyond our experience, could we really even call it form, right? People, philosophically speaking, argue over these concepts. And if these concepts are imposed upon people, in my view, that's a sign that organized crime is afoot and that people are being genocided based upon their beliefs, right? Now, you could go, secularist, cultic along these lines of consideration, like communist Chinese are doing right now, or you could go compulsory religious with the whole compulsion scheme, right? Where you compel people to believe this or believe that, or else consequences, right, are suggested by people who have no idea what they're talking about, really. It's written, though, right, in the book that is considered to be holy, written supposedly by God. A human wrote it, or a group of humans wrote it. There might be a lot of interesting and valid information in the book, but to get at that information, one has to think freely and be free to think and consider, to include free to believe or not believe, right? Hinging people's very existence upon their beliefs in compulsory terms, that's something organized crime does for profit, to gain control over people. Gain control over their thinking, therefore gain control over their minds, therefore gain control over their very realities, right? Yeah, transformer. Think transformer. Think induction, the electrical process of induction, right? Somehow induction takes place that moves certain energies out to an appropriate area, marginal area of the universe, whatever that exactly is hard to say. And then some kind of transformation is taking place out there that recycles all this toxicity somehow in the form of incarnational exchange, you might call it, or influence, changing the nature of whatever it is out there on the edges of the universe that keeps us in such a confused state of mind whenever we consider anything that we would call the edge of the universe, right? Or what's beyond the edge of the universe. Well, we can extrapolate that other dimensions exist beyond the edge of the universe, right? But what edge, really, when you consider that the universe is somehow fenced and is a field? But what is the exact nature of that fence? We have yet to conceptualize accurately, in my view, what exactly it is or isn't, right? The nature of the field harmony at work between dimensions that's associated with our dimension that results in a certain harmonious expression somehow of dimension, right? Well, the dimension or the universe values this relative serenity and harmony and tranquility even, right? It maintains itself as a state of existence, an entity of some kind, an entirety of consideration when we're trying to observe into the nature of it, or even the meta nature or super nature of it, right? So, on a smaller scale, there's the planet. Now, the planet seems to do the same thing with toxic energies, okay? They're not at the core of the planet. The core of the planet, you could argue, at least is kept, shall we say, relatively clean. Okay, because it seems like deadly orgone resides on the surface of the planet, but the universe, the larger universe, it's probably plays a role in the transformation of these energies into something of value eventually. And this is something that Wilhelm Reich supposedly studied in studying radioactive material that he had buried after concentrating, orgone accumulator concentrations of orgone upon it, and then burying it for a time or something, and then observing the nature of it later as transformed somehow, right? So there's implied, at least, based on rather scientific, at the least, observations, that something transforms the nature of deadly orgone back into orgone energy that flows, it moves, it pulsates the way nature prefers for it to do so in maintaining life on the planet, right? So then there's the human body. The human body seems to do the same thing, right? If you think of the human body as its own antenna that's got a circuit board of a sorts associated with it that channels orgone energy along meridians or whatever around the body and through the body. The body also kind of moves toxic energies to the surface of the body, where the result might be a tendency to get acne, right? Or suffer acne, especially during adolescent years when puberty brings about the practical circulation for reproductive purposes, deadly orgone with orgone energy in a certain alchemical mixture, you might say, that results in, playing a role in initiating certain hormonal activities to initiate, you could argue. The degree to which scientists can observe such a thing is kind of hazy or arguable, right? Potentially even. But, transformations are taking place in the physiology around adolescence, surrounding adolescence, that initiation of puberty, it's termed, that is associated with reproduction, associated with the evolution of the species, therefore, right? Humans have a particularly strong capacity for breeding themselves, though, and, rising above the influence of natural selection, to the point where, to a degree at least, we have defeated death, though ultimately death wins in the end, right? Every time. But something in nature works to keep death at bay, too, that you could argue is associated with reincarnation of soul. Some kind of transformational process again, that, across the fence that I've just discussed, right? Across the fence communications are associated with it somehow, and you come into a whole new dimension of existence once you leave your former life behind. Your past incarnation is left behind. A new incarnation is experienced somehow, right? Arguably, of course, but as long as these arguments aren't compulsions of a dangerous scope, I think, we're much better off in a much more intellectual kind of a society or culture than when these things become so compulsory that people's lives are endangered by, religions that insist upon taking the land and taking the lives upon that land at the same time. All of Abraham has been engaged in these processes, to include, communism, the communist arm of Abrahamism, genocide, activities associated with that, the taking of lives and the taking of property, and properties even, if you get into out-of-body vampirism, studying into what's going on with that, at the very least. Avoid, in my view, becoming a vampire, certainly, but vampirism is a development of natural processes already taking place that involve the natural exchange of properties of both healthy and toxic scope between individuals. Again, the universes manage themselves this way through intimate connectivity shared between entities of compatible scope, right? So I wanted to get into that whole angle on universal thinking, right? Cancer as a baseline consideration of it, right? The universe, how does it operate as a circuit? Circulating energies other than just electromagnetism of various kinds, right? The whole mapping out conceptually of the universe implies the existence of a universal ether, right? And this ether has different properties at different times and places. And the universe somehow manages these things, right? Times and places where certain maybe toxic energies and substances are managed by a given universal consideration, whether it be the human body, universally shared amongst a common species of humans, we call humans, and also the planet itself, maintaining a layer of deadly orgone upon its surface that does not extend very much into outer space, nor very far into the depths of the earth. There's a certain depth that it can penetrate down into, and no deeper, presently anyway, in my view. Any deeper and the earth might die from it, right? But thankfully there is a transformation of energy states taking place associated with this active and passive management system working the way it does, right? So, I think I covered that subject. We have toxic energies to a degree all along the surface of our bodies, right? And out-of-body vampires like to conduct organized criminal activities in relation to managing this system, where they draw from victims healthy energies and then dump upon victims toxic energies or waste energies, right, from their own astrally projected bodies during sleep, right, that they have some manner of conscious control over. They can visit upon you, right? So with that, thank you for listening. Okay, this process of marginalizing toxic energies to the outer limits of the universe takes advantage of field harmony as a means of facilitating transformations of the natures of these toxic energies away from dissonant forms of energies towards harmonious forms of energies. That, the interdimensional field harmony harmonizes these energies within the dimension, and I guess as they're kind of exchanged also between dimensions, right? How the dimensions influence each other through field harmony being that which can be conceptualized as the medium that exists between dimensions. It's of interdimensional nature, if you want to call it nature, metaphysics or supernature or whatever. I suppose physicists will eventually be able to touch upon interdimensionality on some level of observation, but given that they've only barely touched upon the cosmic ether, this seems pretty far off. I don't know what they've actually observed. They've probably observed comings and goings on a quantum physics level, as far as particle wave phenomena is concerned. But the actual medium that would comprise Gemini, they'll probably never really be able to touch it or observe it. Just extrapolate the existence of it conceptually, mapping it out extrapolatively relative to other concepts and observed natures, measured to some degree. This process of transformation at the outer reaches of the universe would be, from our perspective, observing from Sagittarius and Pisces low perspective, or biologically grounded psychical perspective, or mental perspective, or attentional perspective, awareness perspective, right? This would seem to be an ongoing process that never ends, right? If there's reality anywhere at all, this process would continue to function. It's metaphysical or beyond physics function.